Hi everyone, welcome to Ask a Property Manager episode 64. Today is March 31st, 2021. We're coming to you live from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, Principal Broker of Own Buffalo Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about the actual extension of the National Eviction Moratorium. Should you show an occupied apartment, and how to handle a lease renewal? We'll answer some questions from housing providers around the country and so much more. Before we get to that, we're going to go ahead and plug our social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager drop every Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, live on Facebook. You can also catch the replay the same day on our Facebook page, as well as over on our YouTube page. Don't forget about our Instagram. We post things there that don't make it onto Facebook or onto YouTube. And last but not least, don't forget about the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Current episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast is dealing with drunk tenants crawling through doggy doors, renters violating the rules on subleasing, tenants' employers asking for a W-9 from a landlord, and a couple of other topics. Don't miss out. New episodes of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast drop every other Thursday, anywhere podcasts are heard, or over at rentprep.com/podcast. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the news of the day here. We have two articles. Actually, I'm on the wrong one. We have two articles, both of them having to do with the CDC extension of the National Eviction Moratorium. We're going to go ahead and jump right in here. Both of these are from both of these articles are from CNBC. This one was published on Monday, so it's a couple days behind. CDC will extend the national eviction ban through June 30th. So go ahead and jump into the article here. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has extended the national ban on evictions through the end of June. The COVID-19 pandemic has presented a historic threat to the nation's public health, CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said in a statement. Keeping people in their homes and out of crowded or congregate settings like homeless shelters by preventing evictions is a key step to helping stop the spread of COVID-19. The eviction ban was scheduled to expire in 2 days, that would be today, and advocates warned of a spike in evictions without an extension. Around 20% of adult renters say they didn't pay last month's rent, according to a survey published in March by the Census Bureau. Closer to 33% of Black renters reported the same. Likely informing the health agency's decision to extend the ban for 3 months is the fact that mass evictions could undermine the country's attempts to get the coronavirus pandemic under control. That's because many displaced people double up with family members or friends, or are forced to turn to crowded shelters. During the pandemic, 43 states and the District of Columbia temporarily prohibited evictions, some for as little as 10 weeks. Researchers found that allowing evictions to continue in these states caused as many as 433,700 excess cases of COVID-19 and a 10,700 additional deaths in the U.S. between March and September, when the CDC ban went into effect nationwide. When you're looking at an infectious disease like COVID-19, evictions can have an impact not only on the health of evicted families, but also on the health of the broader community, said Catherine Leifhart, one of the study's authors and a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. At least 2 federal judges have questioned the CDC's power to ban evictions, and property owners have criticized the policy, saying landlords can't afford to continue to house people for free. Short-term policies like eviction moratoria leave renters accruing insurmountable debt and jeopardize the ability for rental housing providers to provide safe, affordable housing, said Bob Pinninger, president of the National Apartment Association. Housing experts said that it wouldn't have made sense to allow the eviction ban to expire before rental assistance goes out to people. Congress has now allocated more than $45 billion in aid for renters, but it could take a few months for that money to be dispersed. The CDC's eviction ban applies to individuals who earn less than $99,000 a year, and couples who make under $198,000 a year. To qualify, renters also have to attest on the declaration to their landlord that they're unable to afford their rent, and that being evicted could result in them doubling up with others or becoming homeless. So we're going to read the second article and then we're going to jump into discussion. I'm going to go right over to the second article. This is a little bit more geared towards the landlord side of things. Again, this one was published on Monday, March 29th as well, today being March 31st. Some landlords sell properties as CDC extends the eviction ban. A federal ban on evictions is putting the squeeze on smaller landlords who are unable to directly access COVID rental relief funds, and some are starting to sell their properties to recoup their losses. This will likely reduce the much-needed affordable rental stock in an already unaffordable housing market. COVID relief bills out of Congress have earmarked over $50 billion to go toward rent relief, but the requirements vary depending on state and even local jurisdictions. Any application for relief must involve both the tenant and the landlord. Tenants must formally declare that they are unable to make their payment in order to get the government money, which is then funneled through to landlords. Landlords cannot request it alone. In some areas, they can help their tenants with the process, but in others, they may not. So if you just happen to be in a jurisdiction that allows you as the property owner to work on behalf of your resident, to be an advocate, to get those funds into their hands as quickly as possible, then you're going to be much more successful, said Robert Pinninger, CEO and president of the National Apartment Association. If you're in jurisdictions that have taken an approach that is not so customer service friendly, then it's going to take longer. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on Monday extended the eviction ban until the end of June as the Biden administration proceeds with the next phase of its plan to stamp out the coronavirus. The program is intended to keep renters safe, yet while large multifamily rental companies can offer concessions and weather some missed payments, smaller landlords often cannot. 60% of single-family rental homeowners who are owed back rent receive necessary paperwork from their tenants as required by the CDC to receive the relief money, according to the National Rent Home Council. I think that number is actually grossly exaggerated. With so many still waiting for relief, however, about a third of landlords said that they will be forced to tighten standards when evaluating future rental applications, and 11% said that they have already been forced to sell at least one of their properties. In the current housing market, which is seeing very high demand and a record low number of homes for sale, homes listed by landlords will likely sell to owner-occupants and evaporate from the rental housing stock. The pandemic-induced run on housing in the past year has caused the amount of rental stock to decrease by over 250,000 units. Rental housing is generally more affordable than home ownership. The thing that keeps me up at night is that we had a housing affordability crisis going into COVID-19, said Pinninger. If we lose that critical, naturally occurring affordable housing that is out there across the country, we're going to have we're going to have a catastrophe on the other side of this. Marilyn Blackburn, a landlord in Washington state for 20 years, has decided to sell her 9 rental properties as soon as she can. It's been 6 months with these tenants, and we've lost, I think I'm out about $12,000 so far just in rents, said Blackburn. And you know they don't allow us to collect late fees either, so there's a couple $1,000s in late fees as well. Again, you still have to keep paying the mortgage every month. Blackburn said that tenants who are not paying are refusing to respond to her. If they don't file the paperwork for relief, she gets nothing. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. That's a very relevant point. It's just frustrating. You know that people are living in my house, taking advantage of me, and there's nothing that I can do about it. A census survey this month found 15% of renter households, or 6.7 million, said they were behind on their rent. Additionally, nearly 27%, or 11.8 million households have slight or no confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent. So some estimates are that close to $60 million in back rents and fees are owed since the pandemic began. You get to a point where you get that far behind that the world begins to cave in on you, and you don't have the desire to try to go through a process that's very difficult and complex to get the assistance you need, said Pinninger. More than half the rental stock in the nation is owned by smaller landlords, and more than half of those landlords have tenants who have missed payments during the pandemic, according to a new study from NRHC. Of course, more than one-third said they have had to dip into personal savings or take out a loan to make payments for mortgages and maintenance on their properties. The financial difficulties encountered by rental property owners over the past year have created real uncertainty concerning the direction of the rental housing market, uncertainty that has only been exacerbated by the myriad of local, state, and federal eviction moratoria, said David Howard, executive director for NRHC. While rental assistance programs will certainly help, for many property owners, it may be too late. Stefan Landrum owns several properties in Massachusetts. He said he finished 2020 with more than a $10,000 deficit in owed rent, 3 of 4 properties in forbearance, and $6,500 in utility payment arrears. Despite this, I think that I'm lucky to be holding on. This is mostly due to a few reliable residential tenants and my business tenants, said Landrum. Unfortunately, I may have to hit the reset button and sell 1, if not 2 properties before this is all over with. So that is both sides of the coin. We looked at an article that's a little bit more geared towards tenants and what it means for tenants with the eviction moratorium. We looked at a second article that's a little bit more landlord focused, talking about what this extension means to landlords. Let's go ahead and jump into a little bit more about what this could mean coming down the road. And the first thing I want to do is say, if you're a tenant, and this is both directions, if you're a tenant and you're behind on your rent, work with your landlord. If you're a landlord and you have tenants that are behind, work with your tenants. It's in everyone's best interest here to work with each other. When you have situations where tenants won't communicate with a landlord or where a landlord won't work with a tenant, it's not in anyone's best interest, especially when you're talking about rental balances, rental arrears that are getting to the point where they're as large as they are. I mean, when you have a tenant that may not have paid rent for an entire year at this point, they're going to be sitting on a large balance. Chances are that money's not just sitting in their bank account waiting to write a rent check, or they would be writing those checks all the way along. Work with your landlord. Tenants work with your landlord. Landlords work with your tenants. Try to get some assistance and try to resolve the problem. Keeping people in homes ultimately is really the best possible option, but it can't happen unless the assistance starts to flow so that landlords can get bills paid, so that tenants can get caught up, things of that nature. It has to work that way. You have to get the assistance flowing. And so far, I haven't seen it, to be honest with you. I think that the rollout of these rental assistance funds has been very, very poorly managed at pretty much every level, local, federal, and state. It's very frustrating to be in a situation where you have tenants that won't communicate. We do have a few tenants that are just not willing to communicate. That's a frustrating situation. We want to work with them, but if they're not willing to work with us, there's not much we can do. More and more small landlords are going to be exiting the business as a result of these moratoriums. I don't think that that's a shock to anybody. The latest stats that I saw were that something like 75% of all landlords, actually a little higher than 75% of all landlords, only own one investment property. Something like 75% of that 75% are what you would classify as an accidental landlord. They inherited a property from a parent who passed away. They had to move across the country to take a new job and had a home in another state that they are stuck with for whatever reason. Small landlords, people that own 1-2 properties, they're the ones that are being hammered the hardest by this. Because if you have one property and you have one non-paying tenant, you're in a bind. You're in a real bind. The more units you have, the easier it is to have some of that ability to, I don't want to say carry, but it's a little bit easier when you have more units to offset some of that. There's more units to offset the risk, I guess, is probably the best way of putting it. But if you're, one landlord with one rental property and one tenant, not a lot of ways to offset your risk there. So you're going to see a lot more small landlords selling their properties. And this is bad for the rental market as a whole. What's going to happen is just what the one article said. You're going to have small landlords selling to owner occupants, which means that unit's gone. It's off the rental market. Nobody's going to be renting that unit in the future. An owner occupant's going to be living there. The other thing you're going to have is large private equity firms coming in to snap up these properties for whatever price they can snap them up for. Whether it be, market value, higher than market value, lower than market value. Obviously, they're going to be looking for properties that they can snap up for pennies on the dollar. When the foreclosures start happening again in a couple years, I say a couple years due to the timeline that it takes to foreclose on something, at least here in the state of New York. When foreclosures start to really process again, you're going to see private equity firms snapping property up left and right and turning them into rental units, which is not necessarily the greatest thing because a private equity firm is not going to offer the same level of flexibility. They cannot and will not offer the same level of flexibility that a private landlord or a smaller landlord may be able to offer. It's bad news for everyone at the end of the day. You're going to see the criteria tighten up. You're going to see large private equity firms that don't really care on any level about the community, snapping up properties, putting tenants in place. Will the tenants be taken care of? Will the properties be taken care of? That's anybody's guess. But based on what I've heard from private equity firms in the past, probably not a real great solution. So going back to the blanket moratorium situation, I personally disagree with a blanket eviction moratorium. There are a lot of cases right now that could be processed. If we're talking about non-payment and you don't want to evict people for non-payment, I guess I can understand that. That makes a lot of sense. As long as there's some sort of funding to help the tenant and the landlord get caught up. Yes, there's funding earmarked, but that funding is really not being distributed in any appreciable way, at least that I've seen here in our market in Western New York. So there needs to be some sort of cases processing through the courts. Holdover cases, nuisance cases where you have tenants that are dealing drugs, or you have tenants that are causing damage to the property. You have tenants that are harassing other tenants, things of that nature. There are cases that are legitimate that need to be heard. And by hearing these cases now, even with these eviction moratoria in place for non-payment, you're at least starting to get in front of the wave of evictions, the self-fulfilling prophecy that they've created here with this wave of evictions that they're talking about. Otherwise, it's going to be years before some people get into court to hear an eviction case. Hearing some of these cases now is the right move, in my opinion. There are some legitimate cases. When you have tenants that are dealing drugs out of a building, when you have tenants that are harassing and threatening other tenants in the building, those are legitimate cases. In a lot of instances that should be heard and should be processed by the courts, even if we're not processing non-payment evictions at this time. So I think that there's, a way that we can go about this without just a blanket, nope, we're not doing anything. The courts are going to continue to not hear cases, et cetera, et cetera. I know it's a little bit long-winded. I know I've been talking about this topic for a while now, but this is really kind of where I'm at on it. I do want to see things start to resolve. I do want to see this assistance get into the hands of the tenants and the landlords that need it. But until that starts to happen, a blanket moratorium is simply not the solution to the problem here for all of the reasons that we've highlighted. So that's my 2 cents on that. We're going to move forward here. Let's jump into something a little bit more lighthearted. Let's look at something humorous. This has got to be the absolute worst bathroom I have ever seen. Wow, it's incredible that somebody thought that this was a good idea, I guess. I can't remember where this one came from, unfortunately, or I would credit the person I borrowed it from. But yeah, hopefully that's not the bathroom that you guys have in your homes. Tip of the day, if you're pouring concrete by a pond that has ducks, it is not a good idea to let the whole crew go to lunch at the same time. And obviously you can see a whole bunch of little duck prints there. I thought this was hilarious. I actually responded to this on the thread that I pulled it off of on Facebook and said, hey man, stamped concrete cost extra. So apparently the ducks were just doing them a favor at the end of the day. So definitely watch your concrete while it's still wet. Don't let any dogs or ducks or anything else run across it. We're going to go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country. We're going to start with this one on showing occupied apartments. When someone's lease is up, do you show their unit in the last 30 days or do you wait until it's vacant and cleaned? I've been showing units in the past with tenants in them, but they never showed well, so I've been waiting until they vacate and I clean, but my vacancy rate is much higher than I would like. Tips and suggestions. This is one that depends heavily on the tenant. If you have neat and tidy tenants, you might be all right showing that unit in the last 30 days. If the tenants are not the cleanest, if the tenants have a pet that might be an issue, if there's some kind of an odor in the unit or something like that, I would probably avoid showing that unit until after it's been vacated and cleaned up. We won't show any apartment that we're actively doing work in just to reduce the liability factor. We don't want somebody walking in and tripping over something, getting hurt, something like that. So we won't show an apartment if there are people actually in there working, just to reduce that liability. Make sure that you have some kind of a clause in your lease that allows for showings in the last 30 days. Let me see if I loaded that next clip up here. I did. This is actually right out of our lease, and we're going to be looking at the third paragraph here. Within the last 30 days of occupancy, the landlord or agent may show the apartment by providing the tenant with 24 hours notice via telephone, voicemail, or email. Tenant authorizes the landlord to provide the agent with a key to obtain access. Landlord or agent will limit showings to 1 time per week, and landlord agent will attempt to accommodate the scheduling needs of the tenant whenever possible. However, the aforementioned 24 hours notice will be considered sufficient notice. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to try to work with our tenants as much as possible to show apartments, because we understand it's obnoxious to have people in and out of your apartment all the time, trying to show it, several times a week or whatever. We'll work with our tenants as much as we can when it comes to showing an apartment. Generally speaking, most of the time, if we're showing apartments, it's going to be a tenant that they're neat and tidy and they understand, and it's usually a non-issue. The one thing I will mention is obviously we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Make sure that if you're showing apartments and the apartments are occupied, or even if the apartment's not occupied, that you're following whatever the COVID protocols are in your area for what it is that you're attempting to do. So, you might have a state that says you can only have 2 people in an apartment at a time. You might have a state that says, you have to stand outside while 1 person walks through the apartment. If that's the case, I would not show an occupied apartment just because there's too much risk of somebody grabbing something. Just follow your procedures. Wear your masks, wear your gloves, wear your booties, whatever it is that you have to do. Follow your procedures and make sure that you're working in a safe fashion. But yeah, that's what we're at when it comes to showing occupied apartments. We do it if the tenants are neat and tidy. If the tenants are not neat and tidy, not so much. We'll just wait until they're out of the apartment. We'll clean it up and put it back on the market. One thing that you can do is if you have good marketing photos from your last listing, go ahead and send prospects the photos that you have and explain to them the property is occupied right now. We're going to begin showings on whatever date. At least that way you can start advertising and start generating some leads even a little bit before you have the opportunity to maybe get in there and start showing the unit. Our next question is on lease renewals. Hi guys, do you mind sharing your procedures for renewing a lease with a tenant? Do you make them sign a lease extension addendum or do you just sign a new lease? So we do a new lease every year because there are changes in our lease every year. They're not always huge. Sometimes it's a typo that gets fixed. Sometimes it's adding a new section because we encountered something in the last year that caused us to add a new section of the lease. Sometimes we're editing or removing a section of the lease. That's happened quite a bit. We do a new lease every year so that everybody is on as close to the most current version of our lease as possible. So even if we decide to go month to month with a tenant, which is exceedingly rare, we really don't do month to month in our market. We still do a month to month rental lease so that they're on the current version of our lease. So if somebody's on a 1-year lease in 19 to 20 and they go to renew for 20 to 21, but they want month to month or we agree to a month to month or whatever, at that point we would sign a new lease with them on the month to month terms. But at least when we sign that new lease in 20, we're on the most current copy of the lease. And then we still watch those on a yearly basis. So we know, okay, this tenant's month to month, but it's been a year since they've signed that agreement. It's time to get them on the most recent version. So just making sure that you're staying on top of stuff like that will make your life a lot easier. You can do it with a lease addendum. There's nothing, again, depending on your state, there's nothing, at least in the state of New York that I'm aware of, that says that you can't just extend a lease with a lease addendum. We used to do it that way. And then we realized that it made more sense for us to just put them on the most current version of the lease and keep them on the most current version of the lease at all times, which is why we made the decision to just go that route and just continue to do the new leases on a year-by-year basis. Falsified applications. So I'll read this one. It's a little bit smaller on screen. Posted on Facebook today by an applicant right after delivering their rental application. We advertised the property on Facebook, so we didn't even have to look too hard to find this post. And obviously the name is blocked out, but it says, who can make some paycheck stubs? This is becoming more and more common across the country. You've got to start watching for fake documents. Fake pay stubs. I'm starting to see more and more people offering to generate fake pay stubs and things like that. You know, it's becoming more and more common to see people lying on rental applications just to try to get out of a current apartment into a new apartment, whatever the case may be, especially when you have tenants that may not be able to get a decent landlord reference. You've got to start watching very, very carefully whenever you're screening your rental applications. For something like a possible falsified pay stub, what I would do would be verify the employment directly by calling the HR department at the company that the person works for. Call the HR department directly. Don't call the main line and then ask to speak to whoever handles HR. Don't call a supervisor because the supervisor might just be a friend who's posing as an employee of the company or something like that. Go through the company directly. Some companies won't verify anything. Some will. Some will say that you have to submit a signed release from the tenant, which should be part of your rental application. You know, an HR verification along with the pay stub is a really solid way to prove that, okay, this is more than likely, legitimate. If the stub is a direct deposit, if you can see on the pay stub that the funds were direct deposited, you could also ask to see a bank statement. You can verify that they have the income coming in that way just by looking at, every 2 weeks, this person has a regular deposit coming in from work. So that's a pretty straightforward way of screening around that as well. Obviously, in this instance, it sounds like this particular rental application is going to be a denial. One other thing that I wanted to mention is a policy that we have when it comes to our rental applications, and that is no blank spaces, and you must be truthful. We don't process rental applications until they're 100% complete. If you're missing information, your application sits until we get the information that we're waiting for. Because there's no reason for us to start processing something get halfway and then have to table it until you get us the information. So we will not process an application until we have all of the information that we need in order to process it. And the other thing I'd mentioned, must be truthful. It's right in our application screening criteria. Being dishonest is not a protected class. If somebody lies on their rental application, you can deny them for lying on their rental application. Understand that you should have a written set of criteria that you stick to each and every time, and that your criteria need to be fair housing compliant. Beyond that, making sure that you're fair housing compliant is important, but understanding what is and is not a protected class is also important, and lying is not a protected class. So that is something that you would be able to deny an application for. If that was the case, if you got to a point where you verified or were unable to verify something because it was a falsified document, that would be an instant denial, at least here in our office. And I would like to think most other people would handle it probably pretty much the same way. That pretty much wraps things up for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for watching. We love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you can help us to improve. Drop a question in the comments either on Facebook or on YouTube, and your question may be answered in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if we brought some value to your day, please do us a favor and hit the thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, so every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week on April 7th at 10 a.m. Eastern with another show you won't want to miss. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.